So let's talk about flow. Who here has been or experienced a flow state? Who here has no idea what I'm talking about when I say flow states? Okay. So I would say all of you at some point or another have been in a flow state. So one of the ways that we can describe being in a flow state from a sports term is being in the zone. Most of you have been in some sort of a zone or flow state, whether it's a few seconds, a few minutes, up to a few days, and even a couple weeks. When you're in a flow state, they kind of call it a flow state because everything is kind of flowy. Everything, every action, everything that's happening is occurring in a way that easily, without any effort, transitions to the next action and the next action. When you're in a flow state, you experience things like when you're having a conversation with one of your good friends, or maybe a complete stranger that you've never met. And suddenly you look up and 15, 20, 30 minutes have gone by and you have no recollection of anything that happened except that conversation. It was such a good conversation. That's a state of flow. Maybe during an athletic endeavor, athletic event, you suddenly could feel outside of your body. Your body was doing what it needed to do, and your mind could actually be at the point where it could observe everyone else on the field and know exactly what you had to do from point A to point B to point C to get something done. So that could be a running race, that could be on a sports team. That's a state of flow. When we're in a state of flow, this is a state of optimum human performance. So this has been measured that within the state of flow, all of these things happen to massively increase our physical and mental abilities. So there should be a really big reason that many of us would love to spend more time in flow or in the zone. The problem is most of us don't know how to deliberately get ourselves into a flow state, even if we have experienced one and want to get back into one. Keep on the slide. So when you're in a flow state, they call it, go one slide back. Thanks. They call it the Superman state or the superhuman state. Stephen Kotler has written a book called The Rise of Superman. This is based on Stephen Kotler's work in the flow genome, which is mapping the genome of flow so that we can figure out what are the triggers and the ways to get into flow deliberately at any given time for any given person. So he wrote a book called Rise of Superman about adventure athletes and executives and elite military going through the use of flow and how we've gone from surfing for the last 1,000 years. A really big wave surf is 25 feet. Today it's 100 feet. When snowboarding first evolved, the biggest gap jump was 40 feet. Today it's 250 feet. And the only way for these adventure athletes to do these superhuman feats is within the state of flow. So he's using a lot of adventure athletes and executives that work from a place of flow to map the genome to help other people figure out how they can be put in flow. So what's going on when you're in flow? Again, you move outside of yourself. So it's a loss of sense of self. So you're moving outside of your head with all the stories that you're telling yourself and all the blinders that you're wearing to a state within or above the body. You're losing your inner critic. So that voice inside your head that's always giving you this negative talk about what you can't do or how you could have better talked about something with your significant other 2 days ago, all the things that are not relevant to the situation at hand that take you out of your body and back into your head completely disappears. Learning is massively increased, 230% increase in ability to learn any skill within the state of flow. 500% more efficient. So a study of executives in flow showed that they're 5 times more efficient. So for all of you, that means coming into work on Monday and working for 8 hours in flow, taking Tuesday through Friday off, and getting more done than your steady state colleagues who work Monday through Friday. So all that extra time that you can spend not in flow, having done all the work you need to do, can be spent either doing things you'd really like to do instead, or doing more work, or just getting a lot more done in the same projects. Within that massively increased learning, 230% increase in learning, 500% more efficient, your motivation goes through the roof as well. So your ability to learn, your ability to do pattern recognition, future prediction, and learn new skills is heightened by your motivation to learn new skills. So motivation goes up, physical skills go up, mental skills go up, and this is because within the state of flow, there's a massive dump of neurochemicals in your brain. There's 5 neurochemicals that come into play during flow, including serotonin, including dopamine, adenine. So these are all neurochemicals that spike in a cocktail in your brain all at the same time, where people will take ecstasy, MDMA, cocaine, speed, marijuana to spike one of those specific chemicals to get a high. None of those illicit drugs put together in a package can spike all 5 neurochemicals at the same time. So flow has been called one of the most addictive states on earth because when people experience flow, things go so well. It's such a fun experience to be part of, and people want more of it. The only way to spike all 5 of those at once in the brain in those quantities is through flow. Go ahead to the next slide. Keep going. We talked a little bit about sense of self, time. So we talked a little bit about this, but when you're in a state of flow, time can speed up or it can slow down. So it can feel like, when there's that sense of immediate danger, and you see in the movies where everything slows down, and your movement, you have plenty of time to make any sort of mental decision, movement, because time really feels like it'll slow down. And it can also speed up, where you're performing an action within flow, and afterwards 3 hours have gone by and it seems like 2 minutes. So there's a Steve Jobs book that was recently published, a biography on him. The author is part of the Flow Genome Project. He sat down in a state of flow, wrote that book in 5 hours in one shot with 0 edits afterwards. So things with creative projects, athletic projects, and work projects within a state of flow can have massive results if you can figure out how to get in and out of that state. Go ahead. We went through the inner critic. We went through some of this. We went through this. Okay, so we know that flow state is a really cool place to be. Who is actually using flow states? So this is actually something that is very new for us to learn about flow states and start to deconstruct what a flow state is and how to get into it. So elite military units for our country right now are learning that if they put their recruits into flow, they can go from absolute novice to expert marksman sniper in half the amount of time. So the 10,000 hour rule of it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert in anything is completely cut in half if you can practice from a state of flow. Go to the next one. So Google, most of us know that Google creates these really world-class environments in which to do their work. They're rich, there's a variety in them, they're complex environments, they have all these cool and unique things that are very different from what you find in most other offices. And what we're finding to get into a state of flow is a very rich environment is required. So Google has been doing this a little bit in their spaces. They have just, and this is, there's some YouTube videos that are private. I might be able to send to some of you if you're really interested. Google has taken what's called the Flow Dojo. So the Flow Genome Project is creating what they call a Flow Dojo to recreate flow states and then map that genome. They've moved all of that to the Google campus so that Google can use some of these toys, which you'll see a little bit later, in learning how to create flow for people at Google so they can work more efficiently and effectively and enjoy their work more. So we know that 71% of workers in our country are actively disengaged in their jobs. So that's not just that 71% of people are bored, they're actively doing things to undermine the work that they're supposed to be doing. 29% of people have jobs that create flow. So if we can figure out how to design the right spaces and the right things and the right mentality to create flow at work, we can make people much happier at what it is that they're doing. And that's something that Google is really working towards. So we know adventure sports athletes, this sense of very high consequence and high risk environment with absolutely immediate feedback is necessary for getting into a flow state. In some cases, that risk can be real physical danger and it can be social danger, which we'll go into in a minute. But adventure athletes, obviously, in some of the things they're doing, are able to do what they do because of being in a flow state. The Red Bull adventure athlete team consistently uses and consults with the top flow experts in the country to make sure their athletes can get into and out of flow. We talked a little bit about this. These are the neurotransmitters that are going on. There's a lot of other things that are going on within the body during flow state. Go ahead to the next one. We're not going to walk through all those. This is a rendering of the Flow Dojo. All of these pieces of equipment actually do exist. I played on a couple of them a couple weeks ago. They're literally all sitting outside Google right now. And what they do is they recreate some of the states of adventure sports and sense of danger and risk to recreate a flow state so they can then map physiologically and neurologically what's going on in the body, again, to allow all of us to get there faster in anything that we do. So this is that Flow Dojo is a project that just received the first round of venture funding this year. They're currently working with, again, elite military, large corporations and executives to help train them within flow. One of the things to recognize around flow is there's what we call a downside of flow. After you get into flow, there's a very last stage of flow called the recovery, which we'll talk about here in a second and why that matters. But these are the 4 stages of flow. It's not an on-off process. You can't move from flow to out of flow to immediately back into flow. The first phase is called the struggle. So this is the phase where you're loading everything into your brain or your body or whatever it is you're trying to do to learn something. So if you're an author and you're writing a book, your desk is piled with interviews and papers, and you're shoving all this information in your head to write the book, and you're at the point of breaking where you just cannot take anymore. Maybe it's a work project where you've gotten so focused on it and you just can't see the light of day. It's just too much at this point, and that's where you need to walk away into the release phase. So what happens in the release phase is you're allowing your subconscious to work on the problem for you and spark the creativity centers of your brain. And we know that you need to completely do a brand new activity that is completely unrelated to what you've been doing. Take a walk, do some gardening, do some physical activity. The only thing we know that does not work during that phase is watching television. That puts your brain waves in a completely different state that will not allow you to get into flow. The next stage is being brought into flow, where everything moves into this flow state that's very in sync with whatever's going on. And then after flow, you've had all these neurochemicals dumped into your brain, your body has been optimized and working at the highest possible level of human performance, and you move into a recovery or a crash. And this is, if anyone's ever drank alcohol and had a hangover, after enough hangovers, you start to realize, okay, there's a lot of negative things that happen during that hangover phase, and you just have to move through that phase, and everything's going to be okay. Your inner critic is going to come back and start giving you a lot of negative information in your head. Things are going to feel really crappy. You've got to regenerate these neurochemicals, and what you don't want to do is dump a bunch of cortisol in your system because you're stressing out about this phase, and you're not producing as much flow, and you're not as creative as you were yesterday, and your athletic skills seem to have tanked from one day to another. This is completely normal. You have to let that go and move through it in order to start the struggle phase back over again. Okay, so how do we actually produce flow? How do we look at creating the right environment and the right things within inside ourselves to allow ourselves to get into a flow state? The right environment is really critical. Go ahead to the next one and we'll talk about these triggers. There's today 17 known triggers to get us into a flow state. They're listed over on the left-hand side of the screen, and these are some of the maps that we've created on how to move from the struggle phase into a flow state. So the challenge to skills ratio, I think, is important for work. If you have ever challenged yourself with a work project such that the challenge you were given was about 4% greater than the skills you have, that's a way that you can move into flow. If the challenge that you're presented with is more difficult than 4% of where your skills are at, you're going to be very frustrated. And if it's much less than that, you're going to be bored. So when you complete a project and do a really phenomenal job at work, and then your boss gives you a more intense and much harder project because you did so great, it may move you out of the flow state and make it much harder for you to complete that. So it works for work team leaders to look at how do you structure challenges and successive challenges to get people to keep them performing at the highest levels. The environment, go ahead to the next one. Environment makes a big difference. There are risks that it takes to get into flow, and that risk can be intellectual risk of doing a good job, presenting in front of the ELT, or a social risk. So a social risk can be extremely different for lots of different people. So for one person, it might be, jumping off of a cliff naked. Okay, that might be something that they need to do. For another person, it might simply be walking up to somebody across the room that they find attractive and saying, I love your shoes, those are amazing. Can you tell me where you got those shoes? And introducing yourself. That can be extremely risky for people like me who are more socially awkward. So that can snap you into a flow state if everything else is that way. Go to the next one. So it's looking at how to take some of these 17 triggers to put us in a flow state, and how do we create those in our workplace, in our environment where we're doing our work, our creative work, or our athletic work. In order to get into the flow state after the struggle phase, we need absolutely clear goals on where we need to be moving towards, and serious focus and concentration. So to me, when I look at what's going on in the open space era that we're creating in the workspace, I love the open space concept, but in order to get into flow and do that serious focus and concentration, we may have to think about how are we providing, how do we find for ourselves a space where we can do some of that work so that we can move into that flow state and be extremely effective and not be distracted 500 times by people walking by and questions and the phone and emails and everything else. Having some sense of control over the work that you do and have is also very critical. Go to the next one. We talked about a rich environment is absolutely critical, and how do we recreate the environment around us to be more varied, more complex, and more rich. So now how can we actually, if you want to practice moving to flow and trying to notice moving into flow, or get into a flow state if you think you've never been into one, these are some of the ways you can try to get into flow. So instant presence. Most of us, and I'm hoping that one of our colleagues here, Lauren, is going to do some really awesome work on coming to work from a place of mindfulness and presence rather than being tied up in your head with all the stories that are going on and all the deadlines you have and everything else we need to do, and working from more a place of power and presence within our lives so that we move through what we do at work and what we do in life from a totally different space that makes what we do much more effortlessly and gives us a much greater ability to connect with others. There are some techniques that can bring you into instant presence. They take about 5 minutes. I can teach those to you in about 30 seconds if people are really interested in some of that. Heart rate variability training, this is what we were looking at a little bit earlier. Your heart rate is not supposed to be steady beating at the same rate all the time. That's actually quite unhealthy. It's supposed to vary between a certain heart rate variability from minute to minute. There are neurofeedback and heart rate variability devices. Some are apps on the iPhone. This is a piece of tech that you actually attach up to your ear or your finger, and it will measure your heart rate variability and how coherent you are between your heart and your brain, and then teach you what it takes to get into a coherent state. So when some of this tech shows you you're in a coherent state, this is what you're looking for, you can figure out in your head or your body, what did I do to get there, and how do I do it without the neurofeedback devices. Brainwave entrainment. There are certain sounds and beats that can sync your brainwaves to a specific alpha, beta, or gamma state. You can listen to those on headphones. It's completely non-distracting, and it puts you into instant presence and into a flow state while you're doing your work. There's apps, some of them are free, some of them cost a little bit of money. Herman Miller used to study this, and we used to have a room over in the back where we used to play brainwave entrainment sounds called binaural beats. They've gone far beyond what the binaural beats are to some cooler tech. But we used to try to create, how do we create the best environment for people to come into work every day and perform at their best? And brainwave entrainment was one of those things we wanted pumped into that space to reduce stress and increase ability to get into flow. I don't believe we've looked at that stuff for about 20 years, but it was really cool that we used to at least look at some of these things, and hopefully we can in the future. There's, I call it the tech hacker way. There's a yuppie way of getting into flow. It's not for public consumption, so if you really want to know that way of getting into flow really quickly and easily for creative art projects outside of work, let me know and I can tell you what that is, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. So go to the next one. And it works. So So I've heard. Okay, so obviously there's some ways to get into flow, and we can talk more about those if you want to know, and we can do a separate presentation on bringing everyone in the room into a present aware state and moving from there into a flow state at another time. But essentially, this is a state of optimum human performance. If you want to perform at your best, whether you're at work, whether you're outside of work, you want to really enjoy what it is you're doing and feel like everything is just moving effortlessly for you. You want to figure out how to practice getting into flow states. So hopefully that was valuable to you guys and helpful. Go to the next slide. I'm not sure that there's... okay, so there's one last quote, which is, if we want to do better, both personally but as a company, our ability to learn faster than all of our competitors, whose products and sales tools look almost exactly like ours, we need to differentiate ourselves, and our ability to learn faster than anyone else in our marketplace is what's going to keep us ahead in the future. So I think a flow state is one of those ways to keep us engaged, interested, and moving faster than anyone else. And there are top companies that are looking at how to do this for their executives and their employees. Hopefully we can also take advantage of that. So thank you everyone for being here. I think there's going to be some discussion afterwards that maybe you'll talk about, but I'm available for questions afterwards. I don't know if you want questions after the breakouts as well, but thanks for your time. Thanks for being here. Hopefully you guys found some value. Because this is the first one, please send some emails on feedback to Nate and what you would really like to see. I think people that are really passionate about what they're doing, even if it's stuff that they're doing outside of work, really bleeds into being a better performing worker while you're here. And I think all of us can relate to that and love to hear people that are really passionate about what it is that they do and how they do it. Thank you.